In a world where milliseconds decide champions, one game, one mistake, and one king falls. This wasn't just any chess match. This was Magnus Carlsen, the former world champion, the legend, facing off against Gukesh Dommaraju, the current king of the chess world. And for most of the game, Magnus had everything under control. Every move sharp, every plan precise. But then, with the clock bleeding seconds, he made one slip. And Gukesh, he didn't hesitate. He flipped the script, he took over, and in the end, Magnus, in frustration, slammed the table. Only his king toppled. Gukesh king remained standing. This is the full story of that game, Gukesh versus Magnus, move by move, moment by moment. Let's begin. Okay, so Gukesh was playing with the white pieces, Magnus was playing with the black pieces. It's Norway Chess 2025. Gukesh with the white pieces opened the game with 1 e4. We have the king's pawn opening, e5 by Magnus, and later we had the royal Lopez opening. And now black usually continues with a6, knight f6, and that's how the game goes. But Magnus is like, nah, I'll play knight f6 instead, which is the Berlin defense, a very solid opening to play with the black pieces, because if white goes for the main move, which is short castle, black can simply chop off the pawn in the center with the knight, and after rook e1, knight goes back. We have a couple of trades in the center, and after bishop e7, you can see from the arrows, black wants to castle up, b6, bishop b7. Black is having absolutely no problem as the center has been clarified. Mostly the endgame would be a draw. And if Magnus is playing with the black pieces, that's for sure. Instead, Gukesh is a fighter, he likes to fight, he's having white pieces, he goes with d3, pushing the pawn, protecting the pawn. We have bishop to c5, simply developing the bishop, c3. Now c3 is a multi-purpose move, you can play b4 attacking the bishop, d4 attacking the bishop. You're making a square on c2 for the bishop to go back, which is a general idea, typical idea. We have castle, castle, d6, both the sides, just playing normal chess, h3, covering the g4 square from the bishop, a6, the bishop goes back. Black is also doing the same with h6. Rook goes to e1, developing the rook, b5, bishop goes back, bishop goes to b6, because the general idea after bishop b6 is to go back with the knight and push the pawn on the queen side with c5. We have knight to d2, and another idea is knight f1, knight g3, knight f5. So black is like knight to e7 with the idea of c5. And now white decide to play the move a4. Now white wants to capture the pawn on b5. After a b5, the rook is hanging on a8. Magnus is like, fine, I'll play the move rook to b8. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll strike in the center with d4, which looks like a good move. And now knight to g6 by Magnus. Knight goes to f1, and now we have c5 by Magnus. Knight to g3. Position looks a bit complicated because many exchanges can occur in this position. So Magnus is like, okay, allow me to simplify the position with cd, cd, and ba. Bishop cross a4. And you see, in this position, Magnus is like, okay, I'll play the move bishop to b7, simply developing my bishop, putting some pressure on the pawn on e4. Gukesh is like, okay, I'm going to push my pawn to d5. And after d5, finally, the trades that are meant to happen, and now we have a position. Black is having a weakness on a6, white is having a weakness on b2. White's e4 pawn is a weak pawn, black's d6 pawn is a weak pawn. So now, you see, we have an equal position. Engine says it's absolutely 0.0, but here's the moment where the experience kicks in. Magnus is like, okay, I'll play a5. I'm going to push my pawn, protect my pawn, maybe make a square for the bishop to go on a6, which looks like a good diagonal. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll play bishop e3. I admit that your bishop on b6 is a good bishop, eyeing on my king, so I'll just play bishop e3. Magnus is like, okay, I'll just play bishop c8. Instead of capturing your bishop, I'll just play bishop c8. My idea is maybe I'm looking forward to some trades on h3. Who knows, a sacrifice maybe. Or maybe just bishop d7. Trading of the bishop. Because your bishop on a4 is generally a good piece. And also at the same time, I'm trying to open up my b8 rook, attacking the b2 pawn. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll just play b3. Makes sense. We have a trade of the bishop, and now we have the move knight to f4. Magnus is like, I'm just making my knight even better. Who knows, I might sacrifice on h3. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll just play bishop c6, putting my bishop also on a nice square. Also opening up my rook on the a5. Magnus is like, okay, I'll play rook b4. I'm activating my rook, putting some pressure on the pawn on e4. But actually, according to the engine, there is a typical sacrifice of bishop h3, gh3, knight h3, king g2, and knight g4. A very strong move. You can't really take the knight, thanks to knight f2, and you lose the queen. And here, eventually after knight f4, you see two knights are too much powerful for the king, and the position is very complex. And somehow engine says it's slightly better for black. Instead, we have the move rook to b4, which is practically a good move. You're trying to get all your pieces into the game. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll play queen c2, defend the pawn. Magnus is like g6. It's time for me to play g6, push my pawn, and just take away some critical squares from your knight on g3, which looks like a good idea because maybe the knight is aiming to jump on f5. Who knows? Maybe. So we have g6 by Magnus, and now we have king to h1 by Gukesh. Why king h1? Because maybe he's just scared of some bishop cross h3 stuff, which is actually a very strong threat. For example, if white goes for the best move, which is like somewhat of a best move, which is knight e2, black can already sacrifice with bishop h3. Takes knight h3, king g2, and now comes knight cross f2. If you take knight g4 check and you lose the rook, and you see there are some very complications happening up, so we have king h1. So that if you take on h3, I'll just take it back, and after knight h3, there is no check. Makes sense. Magnus is like, okay, bishop a6. I'm just opening up my bishop, putting it on a nice diagonal. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll just play queen a2. I'm attacking a pawn on a5. That's a weak pawn. Magnus is like, who cares for the a pawn? I'll just go for your e pawn. Because guys, just try to understand. Even if white is able to capture the pawn on a5, the main pawn is the e4 pawn. Because once the e4 pawn collapses, you can understand how the d and the b pawn are already a bit weak. Gukesh is like, okay, I'll first defend the pawn. Magnus is like, not so soon. I'll push my pawn to h5 with the idea of h4, attacking your knight, and then eventually I'll capture the pawn. Gukesh is like, oh, okay, I can't really help it with that, so I'll just go for capturing the pawn on a5. We have a queen trade, and now h4. We are in the end game. We are in the space where Magnus is the god. We have rook to a4. Obviously, if you try to go back with the knight, that's bishop f1, and you see this is weak, this is weak, f2 is hanging, this is absolutely Magnus cinema. Black is going to basically completely dominate the position. Instead, we have the move rook to a4. Okay, rook a4 is a very interesting move, first of all, because, like, for example, if you just try to trade off the rooks and say that knight is hanging, after fg3 you will notice the knight and the bishop is hanging. Like, the knight is currently defending the bishop, but once you move the knight, because the knight is hanging, the bishop is collapsing, and that's it. That's it, yeah. So it's actually a good position for white. So instead, Magnus is like, okay, I'll just get all my pieces with rook f to b8, rook a2, and now we have the move king to g7, which is actually the best move in this position, which is insane. Finding king g7 in such a position, like, he's a man of patience. King g7 is a very interesting move. You are just trying to improve the position of the king. You can't really move the knight because the pawn collapses. And you see, if I just go for capturing the knight after takes, there is the same problem. Though it's good for black. Still, Magnus is like, I'll just improve my king. You can't really do anything. Gukesh is like rook a7. And now rook d4. Once again, a very strong move. Now the rook is defending the bishop, and now Magnus is looking forward to capture the knight. We have knight f3 attacking the rook. And now we have the move h cross g3. Magnus decided to capture the knight. And now we have the move f cross g3. For example, if you just try to capture the rook in this position, after e d4 attacking the rook have to capture the pawn. Bishop e4, and you see there is too much pressure on the pawn on g2. The pawn on d5 is collapsing. The b3 pawn is weak. White can push his d pawn, and this is absolutely game over for white, and this is just that's it. This is over. So Gukesh is like, I'll first go for capturing the pawn, attacking the knight. And here we have a knight cross h3, a very strong move played by Magnus once again. Though a better move even would have been bishop cross e4. That's a pawn up. If you try to, there are two possibilities, you can go for capturing the knight or you can go for capturing the rook. For example, if you just go for capturing the rook, e d4, rook goes back, knight h3, because you can't really take because the pawn is pinned. And once again, this is completely winning. The d pawn is getting pushed, the b3 pawn is hanging, knight f2 is coming, and this is absolutely it. That's it. And if you just try to go for capturing the rook in this position, if you just go for trying to capture the knight in this position, after rook check, the king goes back. And you see, king g7. Why king g7 is a good move? Thanks to takes, rook goes back, and knight g4. You have to take rook h8, and that's it. That's GG, that's the mate. That's it. That's why bishop e4 would have been the best. But still, knight h3 is still a good move. gh, bishop takes the pawn. Now the knight is pinned. Thanks to there is no pawn on g2. You can't really take the rook. So we have king to h2. Now Gukesh wants to capture the rook. Magnus is like, okay, rook d1. You can't really move the knight, that's the mate on h1. Rook h1 is a mate. And yeah, if you try to capture the knight in this position, which according to the engine is the best move, though after rook f3, you see, material-wise, the position is even. Engine says it's -4 because there is some stuff like rook d2 check and you can try to push your e-pawn, but that's not so easy to understand. Though, Magnus is playing with black, but still. Magnus is like, I want to win this position because definitely I'm better. I would like to keep maximum pieces on the board. Who knows, the bishop can go for capturing a pawn on d5. That makes sense. Rook d1. We have g4. And now, bishop takes the pawn. We have a bishop trade. The rook goes back and now knight f4. Now this is absolutely Magnus type position. You are a pawn up. You are trying to improve your position and that's it. It looks like a game over. Gukesh is like rook c2. I'll try to generate some counterplay. Who knows knight g5? Magnus is like king f6. And now Magnus' idea is pretty clear. He wants to play in style of Magnus. Magnus wants to play in the style of Magnus by using his king, trying to push his pawn and eventually win. Gukesh is like, I'll push my h-pawn. The king move, and now we have knight check, 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 and the rook goes to f2. And now, Magnus is like, maybe. The king is strong. I can push the pawn now. The king can act as a piece because it's the endgame, and now I can push the pawn. Now, on the other hand, the king is also a liability. Because I can actually mate the king. The king is weak. So, Magnus is like f6 because the pawn is hanging. White wants to capture the pawn. It's f6. Though, a better move would have been rook h8 and the pawn on h4 is simply hanging. You can't really protect it. And after knight f7, just rook check and that's a mate. That's game over. We had f6. A mistake by Magnus. Check, check. We have a pair of rook trades, and now knight check. And you see it's a check, and now Magnus is going to lose a pawn. And that's exactly, first king g3 because your rook is hanging. Still you are going to lose a pawn. Magnus pushed. That's the take. And now rook goes to f8. And now that's a check. And the knight goes to d7, attacking the rook and the pawn. And now, you see in this position, if black tries to move the rook, protect the pawn, white can anyways capture the pawn. And after rook takes, white is a pawn up and now white can actually win. Then this position, after knight takes the pawn, black can give a check, where you can sacrifice the rook for the knight, and after king f4 it's a draw. Though at the first glance it looks like a winning for black because black is having a passed pawn. But thanks to the knight and these two pawns, which is good, after push knight c4, which is the only move in the position, push, and now white can start his own pawn, just like this, and both the queens are getting made on time. That's the beauty. So Magnus is like, it's a draw, I won't really go for that. He decided to play the move knight to check. You see, it's a check. You move the rook, you move the king, you lose the rook. So Gukesh is like, now Gukesh is having a knight. And Magnus has seen this position. Magnus knew that Gukesh will go for sacrificing the rook and he would be a piece down. But Magnus believes these two pawns are much stronger than the knight. This pawn is much faster. If you have push, knight goes back. Push, knight goes back. And we have king to e3. Because if you try to push the pawn, there is simply knight e4. There's knight e4. If you try to make the queen, that's a check, and I can pick up the queen and I can win. Like, if the king move, I'll just chop this pawn and now I'll just make a queen. That's it. That's it. So Magnus is like, okay, I'll just play king to e3. I'll just cover the square. Gukesh is like knight to a4, which is the only move in this position. And this is the move which I personally believe Magnus missed, because now white wants to play the move knight b2, take away the d1 square and just push his h pawn, and that's the win. That's game over. We have e4. Magnus is going all in with his pawns. h5 takes, king goes to d2, knight goes to b2, d3, check, and king to f4. This pawn is getting captured on the next move. You can't really protect it. Even if you try to push, I can take. You make a queen, I can take. White can make 2 queens, and that's win. Magnus resigned after king f4, and you know what happened after king f4. You know the rest of the stories. Yeah, that's it.